Oh, hello, hello. We're in different houses.
We are. It's a zoomy one,
It's a zoomy
which
one.
makes it sound like it's my dog zooming around the garden because that's what we say when he runs around the garden, like just
It's got the
infused
zoomies.
with the spirit of joy and madness. Yeah. So you can imagine us doing that, listeners, if you want. But like right now, because it's a zoomy one, we're like running around.
No,
Um,
we're very much the opposite.
it's the
We are
opposite.
both in recovery mode.
Yeah, we are.
You are in recovery mode. I did a strongman competition at the weekend, so my body
Yeah.
is in recovery mode.
Yeah, and I've been
Uh,
in hospital, so I'm in recovery mode too. But yes, you've been chucking rocks around a field. I've been doing much sleeping. Um, both very tiring activities. Um, yeah. Um, uh,
but
I,
we're chatting today with Isla.
we
Isla
are
McLeod.
Iona McLeod.
Uh,
How did you first come upon? I because I feel like you sent me a message about her book Rituals for Life. You were like, check out this book I've got, and I was like, already got it, mate. Like, how did you happen
how
upon
did
it?
I?
Did someone just buy it for you? Did they think that's a Lewisy looking book?
No. Periodically, I go through some of those different book websites and I just go quite niche in the old categories and sort of go, well, what's the top 50 things that have come out in education in the last month? What's the top 50 things that have come out in
You're making yourself sound quite professional there. That's, like a good podcaster, like a
oh
good,
shit. And then
responsible. And you also look in the section for silliness and bum jokes, just to
yes.
even it out a bit.
Hey, I managed to get quite a few rude jokes into the I won't say them here, into the Patreon episode that we've just recorded,
Oh,
where I
yeah?
was did that quiz for you. I think I
Yeah.
started pretty high with some rude jokes. And people will have to, so if people want to hear like unprofessional Lewis, they
Hmm.
can listen to all of the past episodes, but also they can, they can, they can listen to the Patreon episode. Because we've got our Patreon episodes and we've got our Patreon feed. So if you're a Patreon subscriber, you get like a separate URL and it sends you there. And not only do you get all the like bonus juicy things, like you and I are gonna, well, I've been doing it on my own, but we're gonna start doing Friday morning, just like live streaming for half an hour, chatting about what we've been up to in the woods, seasonal activities, all that stuff. We do bonus episodes where we talk about like things we do in practice, but also on that feed the people on our Patreon are going to start getting versions of the main episodes with no adverts in them. None of the janky little
Can
adverts
you
that
imagine,
break the flow.
listeners?
So if you're running like an hour of like waffle chat uninterrupted, then you can jump on Patreon. And the lowest tier is $2 a month, which is like £1.80. So
Mhm.
that's worth it to get rid of some of those adverts, really.
We're very, very
And
grateful
all the bonus stuff, all the
to
stuff
all
that's
the stuff, all the
all the
stuff.
bonusy things. And our patrons, we literally just got a Patreon while talking to Isla. The emails
Yeah.
went bing bong because got a new Patreon. So we're, very excited. The episode this time around is made possible by our patrons Julie, Rachel, Emma, Candice, Sarah, Claire, Heidi, Louise, Michael, and Anna. So thank you so much, guys. It's amazing to have your support and
It
hopefully
is it like because we've been doing this for quite a long time now, haven't we? And it's always been free, and it always will be free. And our kind of aim is to because it can be quite a lonely place to be. We often say that if you're doing forest school anywhere in the world, often by yourself, or like you're working in an environment where maybe not everybody's on the same page as you. And we kind of hope that through the podcast we can make people feel like people have said it's like having it's like listening to some mates. It's like having a kind of virtual network of people who might be going through some similar experiences. And we always want that to be free. But the Patreon support just really, really helps us in terms of like, yeah, buying new equipment and kind of explaining to our partners that actually this isn't hours and hours and hours of work that we do for zero money. It is still, listeners, that is still exactly what it is because we just really like doing it.
we
But
would still do it.
yeah, exactly.
But we
Um,
appreciate the support and the
Yes, we really
you
do.
know
Every little helps, as Tesco would say.
mm,
Um, and yeah, this was a really lovely, lovely, lovely chat with Isla McLeod where we talk about. So she gives lots of advice and tips about how to conduct ritual and ceremony with different groups and in different scenarios, how to connect with place if you're maybe new to that. What else do we talk about? Oh, a bit about eco-anxiety and how to sort of deal with that, navigate that. If it comes up with children near the end, we talk about
how to sort of, I was going to say cope with, and that's not the right words, but how to engage with people that feel like ritual and ceremony aren't for them, either if that's you and you feel like ritual and ceremony aren't for you, you're not supposed to be a ritualistic leader or a ceremonial person, or that you've got people in your groups or people coming to your sessions that might see it as a bit woo-woo. We kind of delved into all of that stuff and had some really great answers and really great thoughts. And, you and I had these questions ready, but even so, we popped up with so many more during the chat where Isla kind of prompted little thoughts for both of us. It's a really lovely episode, really chilled out and hopefully useful for people bringing more ritual and ceremony into their sessions and their lives.
Yes, and quite good for, it's nearly midsummer. So I feel that's quite a good, time of the year to be having this kind of conversation. Big, important event in the wheel of the year. Maybe people are thinking about marking that in some way.
Yeah.
Yes, whatever hemisphere you're in. Yes, enjoy, listeners.
I'm Wem.
And I'm Lewis.
This is the Forest School Podcast.
Let's go!
Lovely to see you both.
You too. Thank you so much for joining us.
That's a pleasure. Wem, you look familiar.
Yes, I came to one of your events, the one on the outskirts of Totnes. I've forgotten the name of the woodland.
Serpent and the Seed, yes.
Yeah, that was great. I was just trying to remember when that was now.
Spring equinox.
Yes.
That's right. No, I remember the email now. Yeah. No, I'm glad you were there for that. It's very weaving, that one.
It was amazing. Yeah. Really, really good. Where are you and what have you been up to today?
I'm in Bruton in Somerset, and today I've had a few clients this morning and I'm just catching up on emails after really lovely. I just did a little Instagram post because I've had a very full week of all sorts of ceremony. It's just been lovely. So I haven't been on my computer much.
Nice. Yeah. Great. Nice. So Lewis has already pressed the recording button, so we're already recording, and we'll just edit it, as we need to. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us, Isla. We're here today with Isla McLeod. So Isla, you are a that's a hard word to say, ceremonialist, and you know a lot about ritual, and you've written a lovely book called Rituals for Life, which Lewis and I both got. Lewis has even got it there with him.
Here, look, full of sticky things. These are my sticky things that make clickety noises.
And as you were just saying, I've been to one of your events that you ran at Spring Equinox. But can you tell us a little bit about your journey and sort of to where you are now and your journey with nature connection and your connectedness to the earth, and how did you arrive at the place that you are now?
Yes, I'll try and make it succinct.
Okay.
It's been a bit of a winding journey, and it wasn't that I had that kind of connection with the natural world growing up, but I think it was sort of always there in the background as this place of refuge and sanctuary. And it was over time, I think, going through adolescence and my teenage years when I felt very apart from the natural world, but also myself, and a sense of community and meaning, that I had to sort of go to the underworld, as it were. And it felt like I went there through my sort of time at university and early years of my 20s, of feeling like I was really questioning the system that I lived in, and that this was what I was being told the sort of the layout of my life would be, sort of university, getting a job, having a family. And there was just no meaning for it for me. It felt like it was really lacking in this sense of the sacred and something of some enchantment, some wonder, and some of the mystery. And from a childhood that was really varied and beautiful, living in some quite different countries, I had a taster of what it felt like to be in cultures where ritual and ceremony was a part of everyday life, and, honouring of the ancestors or marking the seasonal changes. And I think that always was in my psyche as this possibility of how I could bring more of that into my life. So mid-20s, I sort of left London and the life I knew and moved to Devon. And there I spent some time in meditation retreats and really began inquiring more into my mind, my emotions, and the nature of reality, so that I had a better understanding that there was so much more that we could be devoting ourselves to in this life. And I had to find my way with what that looked like, that was resonant for me and that made sense on these lands. So I went and spent some time in the forest and had these years in a yurt, really making that commitment to be an apprentice to nature, so that I could have teachers that were sort of directly connecting me with the source. Since we don't have those kinds of intact lineages here, I didn't really have the elders to turn to, but I did have the trees and the stones, and went to visit various places around our isles and began working very deeply with the trees and the cycles. And in doing that, I found ritual became something that naturally arose from wanting to give thanks, from wanting to mark particular thresholds of my life. And it gave me that sense of connection with a sense of the spiritual world, with a sense of the invisible beings that I share this world with, that began to really feed my sense of belonging and kinship and connection, which I hadn't felt. I'd felt very apart from humans, from myself, and it was a way for me to feel like I was sort of building bridges back to the earth and to a sense of my sort of soul path. So that was where I was in my late 20s, and then having a son and wanting to make this meaningful path of work, it felt like the natural progression to be offering this to support others in making those bridges back to the natural world and to honour those significant thresholds that we meet in our life with ceremony, with ritual, and with different other, I call them pathways of belonging. So other things such as pilgrimage and crafting and drumming, things which help bring online those innate ways of knowing that we are woven with all life and that we're all part of this great mystery in some way.
Thanks to everybody that's rating and reviewing on Spotify and iTunes. It really helps us to find new listeners and share what we're doing with more and more people.
Thank you. That's a really, detailed yet succinct description of your journey, which is probably quite an unusual one to most people today. And I'm just wondering if you can describe a little bit more in detail what you do sort of for a living, or do sort of throughout your average week or month, for some, especially for those who might not be very familiar with sort of ceremony and ritual.
So if I have invitations to support people with ceremony, that could be anything from a wedding ceremony to naming a new babe or a blessing away for a mother. Can also be celebrating significant birthdays, like I've had quite a lot of 50ths recently I've been honouring. I've also been working with groups around their perimenopause, so entering into that time in their lives. So I would normally then have this time of kind of crafting ceremony. So that's more on my own. I'm there sort of bringing in the different elements of ceremony to create a form of what the outline could be. And then I would hold those events. I'm also offering more one-to-one work. So I support people in a kind of mentoring capacity, which might be to help them design rituals for themselves, how to connect more deeply with the natural cycles and rhythms. Also supporting people, academics, in bringing more of an animist perspective into a scientific lens, which has been really interesting. And also with people that, I call it soul making, but it's working with people in a capacity where they're seeking more meaning in their life and wanting to enrich their experience of that kind of embodied, animate way of relating with the natural world, the more than human world. So I do offer shamanic healing sessions and journeys, and taking people out on the land to hold sort of pilgrimages in a way, so that they have this experience, a really embodied experience of being able to hold themselves through a passage of time where they're feeling like there's a threshold in their life and that they're really ready to make some kind of intentional change. So it's a really lovely variety of being out, holding ceremony for people, crafting ceremony. Obviously, there's the admin that goes behind that. But any week can look very different. And I'm also trying to create more time to write and be able to deliver some of these approaches and online content and various things. So there's a bit of writing as well going on at the moment, which I really enjoy.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that you said that when you were sort of beginning this journey that we don't have our kind of our own lineages intact in this land. Is that something that you're sort of looking to change in terms of yourself, maybe passing on knowledge or passing on ways to connect? Do you see yourself in that kind of role?
Well, I would hope that at this time we're bringing more awareness of the value and the necessity of the village, that we've become so isolated and fragmented that we just don't have that pool of wisdom that's available to us from our elders, but also what the children can bring to support and enliven the elders, and, you know, raising children not just within the parents of the family, but other elders and adults that can support with that. And I feel like a lot of my work is preparing to what I would call becoming a good ancestor, so that when I am across the other side of the Great River, that I will have my great-grandchildren at some point, you know, calling on me to be a guide for them in their lives. And I would love it if that would happen before I die, that I'm able to be that old lady by the fire that's there weaving and telling stories and being, I think, also, you know, discerning and truth-telling. So it's not all... there is that image of that sort of really gracious, kind, gentle grandmother, but I think also they can be quite hard-hitting sometimes, that crone image. And I feel already as I sort of progress towards my menopausal years that there is this ability to be, be careful not to swear, hang on, so that...
fucking go for it.
In that sense of really not giving a shit what other people think, that actually you're really walking your talk and not just playing nice, that there's something of, you know, a woman embodying more of her power as she becomes older, and really wanting to give permission to others to do that. So yes, I hope very much that I'm able to pass on some of what I've learned before I go.
Yeah.
I wondered if I can ask, I was scribbling down on post-it notes as you were talking. You mentioned quite a lot about talking about like elders and ancestors and like building up that relationship, and sort of allowing people to make that connection. And I think, I don't know whether this is just my own experience, but I think what I commonly see is like relationship with maybe more ancestors than elders is like a feeling of like guilt or onus or like pressure, that there is some sort of like, you've got to live up to your ancestors, you've got to like do this thing, and like it's I'm wondering if you have any things about like flipping that narrative so that it can become questions on like, I rarely see people go like, oh, I'm sure your ancestors would be really proud if they could see you now. The conversation always seems to be around like, are you doing enough to live up to that lineage? Are you doing enough to... I'm sort of waffling here, but I'm wondering if you're catching the sort of that flow of like it not being a negative looking down upon you with tuts, it being a like, they're really proud of you relationship. Do you have that kind of stuff going on?
Yeah, I'm trying to think who told me once when I was working with ancestral healing. I can't remember. Somebody said to me that the greatest gift we can give our ancestors is just offering up and sharing the gifts that we're here to bring. And that might feel like a big responsibility. And in a way it is. Like, we have got a purpose here to be showing up as, you know, good guardians and protectors of the earth. And yes, it might fall sadly on our sort of Western psyche, which is often quite self-depreciating and a bit hard on ourselves into that way. But actually it can really motivate us to want to live fully and express ourselves in a way that is really honouring of the unique gifts that we've inherited through our lineages. But I'm also aware, and you speaking to that there are a lot of people that find it difficult to relate with their ancestors because they feel the guilt or the shame that they carry from what their ancestors did, which they obviously don't agree with. So there is also that perspective, which makes it quite difficult often for people to want to relate with them, or to do so in a way that feels nourishing, that it's actually easier for them not to acknowledge that, or that there's a lot of healing work to be done there. So it can be quite entangled. And I think where I also felt I naturally went was initially through working with the trees as ancestors, that actually there can be a lot that makes it difficult to relate with our human kin. But the trees, the stones, all these other beings that have been on this earth for so long and expressing this incredible reflection of our potential might be a way in for people in that respect to also connect more deeply with place and belonging. If also their lineages don't come from these lands or they've moved, that can also be quite complex. So I think that's a really helpful thing to remember when we're also considering the web of life, that it's not just about our human relations, but very much about the greater beings that have been dwelling here before we came.
That's lovely. And I really wanted to ask you actually about connection to specific place, because a lot of people who listen to this podcast are people who are working as forest school practitioners or working in the outdoors a lot. And some people like ourselves, we're lucky enough to have our own woodland where we are pretty much every day for about 7 years now, and we've been in that same place. And one of the most life-changing things for me about kind of making that journey to be a forest school practitioner is the connection with place, because through visiting one place every day for that long, that's been my kind of root to nature connection. And definitely through kind of, it does feel very, I don't know, there's a heavy element of kind of history in there as well, in terms of learning what it's like to be living outdoors and more connected to nature, because you're going to the same place every day, noticing tiny changes through the seasons, and things that are the same this spring compared to last spring, or things that are different, and so on. But there's probably also people listening to this who are working in many different places, or trying to find a place, trying to find a bit of land, which is really difficult for people. And I wondered if you could say some things about the very beginning of starting a relationship with a particular place, like how you might start that.
Yeah, I really relate with that feeling of also not quite feeling like it's the right place, or, if we're in an urban environment, or I moved into a town and my son started school and I'd lived in the yurt for 7 years. So it was quite a big transition. But I did take this place because there was this chestnut tree in the garden, which just spoke to me as soon as I came to visit as a place of anchoring. So that was the first connection that I really intentionally made when I moved, was, creating a space of refuge, or like a sit spot, somewhere where you're able to connect in with the spirit of the land that you live with. And it can just be as simple as that. You just have somewhere that you sit, and, as you say, tending or being with a place every day will naturally reveal to you the ways that it shifts throughout the seasons, and what other beings live there, and, the birds, different insects and other beings that you might see crossing the path. And even if you don't have a sense of, or a garden whereby you have, trees, or that if you're in a flat, for instance, there are ways of being able to connect in within our bodies, which is something that I've been working a lot more with people that live in urban environments, that we have this amazing temple of earth that is our resting place for this life. And that within our bodies we can connect with the elements. So we have the earth of our body, we have the waters in our blood, we have the air that is constantly being moved through us, and then the fire that is the warmth of our bodies. And if there's a disconnect with the sense of place, then we can start to really find that within ourselves, that we can actually find a resource and a doorway into the natural world through our own bodies. But if you do have a place and, you started that initial contact, then it's, I think, really lovely if you can to spend time with it before you necessarily sort of begin building upon it. So when I moved to the woods, I allowed the full cycle of the year to see all the changes within those seasons before I then started to put little altars in place and had put a hammock between two trees. That was my way of sort of listening and not wanting to leave a mark. But then it might reveal itself to you of like where the places are that you sense there is a certain sort of constellation of energy, or a place that you feel particularly peaceful in, that there's somewhere that you feel drawn to creating something like an altar, or you might with the seasonal shifts, have a time of ritual where maybe you make something like an earth mandala, but having that sense of reciprocity with place so that you know that as much as you're receiving from it, that you can give back in some way. And I'm thinking of when I began writing my book, I wanted to have a connection with the River Brue, which is about 5 minutes walk from my home. So after the school run every day, I would gather water from the river and carry it back to the tree in my garden. And as I was carrying the water, it would be a time of prayer, of really giving thanks for whatever it is in my life on that day that I wish to give thanks for. And then I would offer the water to the roots of this tree. And it was something just in that quiet tending of, and the relationship between the waters and the roots that really began to weave in a sense of my purpose of being here, which prior to that I hadn't really understood. I was like, why am I in this town? I mean, I know my son's at school, I need to be, but I often feel we're called to a place, and I couldn't really understand why I was here. But something in that just quietened that kind of questioning and concern to just really understanding that or really feeling like I had landed here. And that was over, a course of a few years. It does take time, as we know, in our human relationships, to build up trust and a sense of knowing the other's needs. And I think having that want to really listen so that we are, in whatever way that comes, even if it's a flicker of an idea or you're there and you hear a voice, however it feels that you receive insight about what it is that this place might benefit from. There, I think that's a great place to start.
You will never need to go back to mundane marshmallows ever again. My book, Forest School Cooking, covers everything from how to build ovens to cooking in new and exciting ways, and a whole load of easy and amazing recipes that your groups will love. Order your copy today on Amazon.
Yeah, and I think that probably comes up in forest school sessions as well for people, that a lot of the groups and the children will actually come up with those ideas that then become quite ritualistic, probably without anybody necessarily naming it as such. I'm trying to think about things that maybe our learners have done, but there's definitely things that, about reciprocity. So some of our children, we've got bluebells on our site, and some of the children really enjoy sort of picking the seeds and scattering the seeds when they're dry and things like that are just... They just sort of happen, don't they? No, we don't design that. We don't go, oh, today we're going to do this. They just happen. I think that's...
I think quite often, because for small children in particular, it's often easier to connect with the fauna in a space, even if they're not seeing it. Like, it doesn't have to be there with them. The amount of homes that have been made and given to the woods for animals that these kids have never seen. These are for animals that sometimes don't even exist in the woods. They're like, oh, this is for the wolves. This is where the wolves are going to eat. And so but then sometimes I've made a little shelter for hedgehogs, or I've dug this out so that the squirrels have got somewhere to drink from, or those sort of things. They're not what's the word? When it's like a one-way relationship, like you might have with a celebrity. Is it parasocial? Anyway, that word where it's not face-to-face, give and take. These things, it's done out of they just seem to know that they're sharing the space with the wildlife and will give back in that way. And sometimes they're giving back to the flora, but I would say it's fauna more often than not. And I think they also quite like the story of being able to go... and they'll come here and then they'll do this. And then I've made a pathway for them to go over here, and having a narrative to hang on it is quite useful for them.
That's beautiful. And I wonder, do they have, or is there any sense of the sort of not the more than human, the invisible? Do they make little homes for fairies or any other beings that dwell in the woods?
We have had that, especially if we have told some folk tales. So we have one summer holiday group who you just never, often when you tell a story, you never really know what stories are going to land and kind of be like a springboard for different things. But I think it was last summer I told a story about a child being taken by the good folk who lived in the hill, and the journey that the parents had to go on to get them back. And that really ignited something in that particular group at that particular time, whether the conditions were just right or whether there was something in the air that felt quite kind of magical. And there was a lot of play, wasn't there, Lewis, that week about the good folk and the small folk, and kids who would never have necessarily ever heard of that before. Yeah.
I think that's what's so beautiful about story, but also being in natural settings, is that we haven't historically for some time really valued the superpower that is our imagination, but children can really show us with that just one little piece of a story they can ignite with all different colour and texture and make something else from it. And I think that's something to really cultivate in these kinds of settings, is to really allow them to guide us in what they see that might not, we don't, that there's this whole landscape beyond the visible that they, I think, touch into much more readily than we do.
I think there's something as well, isn't there, about like using natural spaces for this kind of ceremony and ritual that gives you, on my experience anyway, a sense of like things that you can't do in spaces where you feel like you're being watched in the same way. There's something about a natural space that quite often, we're lucky enough to have like a very dense woodland, and so you can not that you're being silly, but you can be like earnest in a way that you wouldn't be on a school field when you're being watched by mealtime assistants and the year sixes are trying to play football. Like all of those things, like the woodlands and natural spaces give you a sense of like, I can go into this little world earnestly, not worry about being watched. Yeah. And actually one of the things that we made a note that we wanted to ask you about is like that sometimes that's paired with people who don't have that sense of ritual or ceremony or things in their day-to-day life. And then they're, I'm going to use the word ignorance, but I don't mean that in a derogatory term. I just mean like lack of experience. It can then come out as like dismissal or, challenging nature. And whether you've had any experiences of trying to hold a ceremony in that way, whilst also dealing with those kind of feelings about like, yeah, this isn't real, this isn't right, this is silly, all those things.
It's something I've been very aware of in more traditional ceremonies I hold, such as weddings, when I speak with the couple of sort of what language are they comfortable with me using around terminology involved in the sacred, which often has those sort of religious connotations that might be difficult for people. But also recently I was holding a wedding where the groom really wanted to acknowledge the fae because it was on their land that was full of bluebells. But the bride wasn't so sure because of the family, and they might think it was, they might mock it in some way. So we found we found a way of just saying all the other beings that dwell here. So it was sort of a bit more perhaps digestible. But I've noticed that I can often have that reservation going into spaces that feel a little bit more conventional. And often my reservations are very quickly quietened because I think there's such a longing for more magic and wonder and mystery. And it might be that there's an initial kind of resistance and contraction, particularly if it involves things like inviting people to sing that really don't like their voices being heard, or and it depends on how I frame it. But for instance, I held an event, or I was part of an event last week that was a panel discussion in an auditorium, nothing like I'd ever done before. But I wanted it to be an experience of the web of life because we were talking about the web of life. So I suggested I held a ritual to sort of open it and to close it. And I wasn't sure how that would go down, but I kept it really simple. We just offered everybody a stone, and I did a guided journey of just connecting with our sense of belonging through the stone. And I think there's ways of framing it that actually everyone can relate with. And my sense was that those that might have never done anything like that before felt really opened up by it because of the experience of them having this sense of connectedness in a space that maybe normally you go to and it's quite kind of us and them, listening to the people on the stage. And actually it became then just kind of this beautiful symbiotic space where everyone was connected almost in a circle rather than there being this kind of more linear way of being. So it's something that I'm hoping also more to connect with people that are in, for instance, corporate spaces, those people that perhaps haven't had access to these kinds of ways of ceremony and looking at the world, because that's really where we need to be going. It's something to kind of preach to the converted, as it were, but to have this bridge with these maybe more animistic ways of viewing the world, more ceremonial approaches to life. And if we can get that to people that are sort of on the treadmill, that are living in these settings that are devoid of some sort of deeper meaning and connection, I think could create a really important shift that I'm really hoping we'll be seeing more over the next few years.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because at the end of the day, if what you're aiming to achieve isn't going to cause harm to anybody or distress to anybody, whether or not somebody is sort of wholeheartedly, I don't know, in agreement or in belief of the same kind of things that you're talking about, it's overall about connection, isn't it? It's about connection with one another and with a place and with yourself. So it's quite hard, I think personally, to argue that it might not have a place in certain areas. Do you know what I mean? It's quite what you're striving for is connection, and we're really wired for that. So it's got a beneficial outcome. I was going back a little bit to kind of childhood and things. I was listening to, I don't know if you've listened to the podcast called Witch, which is on BBC Sounds at the moment. It's very interesting. It's really good. And there's a lot of crossover there between, so there is, the history of witch trials and those kind of things, but there's also a lot of present day interviews with people who are, very nature connected or involved in ritual and that kind of thing. And the host interviews one group of people, and one woman said, and it really kind of chimed with me, and she said that a lot of kind of ritual and ceremony happens in childhood naturally and through play. And she felt that herself personally, she'd just never grown out of that. She just carried on playing in the way that you might be playing in the garden as a child and kind of inventing spells or making potions or talking to imaginary beings and all these kind of things. And that as an adult, she's just never lost that. Whereas she watched her sort of peers lose that. And you said earlier that sort of nature connection wasn't something that necessarily you experienced as a child, but do you think there is something in that about like not losing that kind of playfulness and there being a link with childhood there?
Absolutely. I know that I've had to reinstate my relationship with my inner child to sort of be forefront when I'm particularly out in the natural world, wanting to have that kind of childlike wonder and curiosity and innocence as in the way that I see and relate with the place. But I think for most of us, sadly, that isn't the case. And I know that I began boarding school when I was 8, and I was living in Nigeria at the time. And I'd already collected sort of different figurines from various markets and had a little portion of shelf that had these beings on, and I had like a little rug on my bed. And it was really through seeking some kind of connection and wanting to try and make sense of the chaos of my emotions, really, that I began experimenting with what I can see now as a ritual. I'd sort of bow down on my little rug in front of these beings, and I'd bring my like sweets from my tuck shop and like put them at their feet. And I had a little bell that I rang, and I would just use it as a time to usually sort of ask for some help or cry. It was a time of real tenderness that I just needed somewhere to go that felt like someone was hearing me and that I felt held. And I know that it was, being in a dormitory with other girls, it didn't take long before I stopped doing that because I realized nobody else was. But I did have a Buddha for my 9th birthday, and it was so organic to know how to be with that wooden Buddha who, every time I came and sat with it, it was natural to light some kind of incense or leave a flower, and just a way of saying hello and then being in silence together and thanking them. So simple, but that thread was the one thing that kept with me throughout all the times when I then felt very apart from the rest of a sort of way of ritual practice. And I think that we need to really encourage that in our children. Obviously, conventional school, I wouldn't say does in any way really have that kind of space for a lot of creative play for the children to see that it's normal. It's actually really beautiful to allow them to follow their imagination and create those kind of experiences of play and spontaneous ritual, and really celebrate it, actually, because that's where we then create our unique relationship with a sense of the spiritual, however that might be. And I think obviously in the past we had too much religious dogma to allow that to happen, but we don't really now. in the mainstream. I think there's a lot more space for people to be bringing that, and for there to be really interesting conversations about, like, you know, who are these beings that you're speaking to or making little homes for, and making it something of everyday conversation, you know, and it can be between parents and children if it's not happening with their teachers, so that also amongst their friends, that it's something that they want to engage with, and to spend time, as you know, I imagine you do, with them in the forest, sort of really having those sort of held spaces whereby they're invited to seek out places where they feel like they can go and either talk to a tree or make a little den for another animal, or somewhere that they feel that they're inspired to make that kind of connection with a place or a being.
Applications for Forest School Leader Training at Children of the Forest are now open. Come and learn with me and Wem at our private woodland down in Devon. Find out more by heading to myforestschooltraining.co.uk. See you there. There's so much in there, isn't there, about that, like, that sense of creativity that you have doing all these things, or that all children that I've ever worked with have. And I think that's something that I've always found, once I take on that role as like a leader in the space, that I then find one of the biggest challenges for me is trying to, you talked earlier about crafting ceremonies, and obviously like thinking up like what will work, and it sounds like you're sort of doing, oh, this group will enjoy this, or they'll get a lot out of that, if I'm understanding that bit right. And I'm always torn between this idea that, like, particularly for our community that we run for our learners, inside the Forest School principles, autonomy is super high up there, not just as something we value, but that there's something that our learners and our families really need. You know, that might be one of the reasons they've chosen to come to us over somewhere else. And I find holding that sense of autonomy and giving people, you know, the reins to a ceremony, but also being in that position where I want to go, well, I've crafted this thing and I think it will work if we do steps 1, 2, 3, you know, trying to give that sense of autonomy, but also hold a ceremony ritual. I find that a really tricky balance. I wonder if that's something, have you come across that balancing act before?
Well, that was partly in Rituals for Life, the book. I had this idea of the 4 seeds, which is something you can sort of have as the guiding format for any ceremony. And if you plant these 4 seeds, then not only will they sort of thrive in that ritual, but also in your life. The first is the intention. So you have the intention of what the ritual is and what you hope to sort of receive from it and what you hope to give from it. And then you have, once you've set that space from the container, then you've got this spontaneous field for however creativity might arise. So in that space, it's the opportunity for anyone present really to sort of express what wants to come through naturally. So it might be something like making an earth mandala, or it might be painting a mask. It might feel like you want to go and build a den that's for one of the beings of the woods. In that time, there is that opportunity and invitation for there to be that creative space. But then you would sort of bring to a close the ceremony by firstly expressing thanks, which is the 3rd seed of gratitude. And then to finish, it's really about how we then experience our ritual being something that can actually feed the greater web of life. So offering our blessing as the 4th seed to those others that we might be able to ripple out some of the good wishes from the ceremony towards. So if you have the kind of container, the beginning and the ending, then within that, it's also a bit like a rite of passage, actually. You've got the sort of entering into a space, and then you've got the cocoon, which frankly anything goes. You know, it's this time of transformation and creativity when you're in some relationship with the unseen. So we're just really hoping that we can be responsive and listen to what we're called to do in that time, and then creating that sort of closing and re-emerging from the cocoon. So that's one way that I would encourage, like how we can hold it when it does feel a bit like there's all these other ideas too. It's sort of, let's think about what the intention is as like the arrow, and really stick with that as a focus. But if I'm crafting something just for myself, it's a lot more free flow usually, and I'll just sort of go with where whatever whim takes me. But I think having that space for being in relationship to what comes without any plan is actually really valuable. And particularly with children, it's great to have them feeding into the space, like what they wish to explore at that moment, and be able to really trust in that and give them autonomy, as you say, to sort of feel that they have the power to do that without feeling like it needs to look a certain way.
Yeah, I think that's just ticked something off in my brain, that I realised that there was a something I was holding that's never actually been said out loud, which is that in my head, I think I've always had the sense that like a ceremony being like quite tight time-wise, almost like a church service thing. But the way, you know, this is 10 minutes and then we're into the actual main session, you know, or this is the 15 minutes that we're going to call it to a close, you know. And so, yeah, I think I was holding that in my own head of like, how do you do autonomy when you've got that? I guess that's kind of what I was asking, was that timeline. But actually hearing you describe it, actually the whole, you know, we can do a 2-hour forest school session and that's the ceremony.
I thought exactly the same thing. Yeah, the way that you just described it, Isla, at the beginning, and then, or, you know, potential for whatever speaks to you in that moment is what you should do. And then coming together at the end is what a lot of forest school sessions look like. Yeah. And I've never really thought of that, same as Lewis, as the entire thing actually being a ceremony or a ritual. And I think a lot of the families that come to us would probably agree with that as well. And I think that's why they come back, because they see the entire thing as that kind of weekly ritual that they do. That's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, because same as Lewis, we've often thought of, especially I guess at particular points in the year, we might feel like, oh, we really want to kind of mark this in a way that feels different to maybe an average forest school session, or a rite of passage with like children moving on from a particular group and things like that. But when you're kind of, called back to remembering that the entire thing is actually quite ceremonial, there seems to be a little bit less pressure there. And often the children will create an extra ceremony or ritual within the session when they feel like they need to. Again, we've had summer holiday clubs where it hasn't happened all the time, but there have been times where the group have gone, right, oh my goodness, it's the last day tomorrow. We're going to have this award ceremony or this session or this show at the end to mark the end of it. And that's always come from them rather than us. And I think that ties into what you're saying, Lewis, about kind of autonomy and then it's organic, that it comes from the group rather than one person, whether it's the leader or just one member of the group going, oh, we really should mark this moment, you know, because I think so. Isn't necessarily the reason to do it.
I think we've inherited a lot of that kind of hangover of religion, where there were very specific ways of doing things in a certain way. It's very rigid and restrictive. So we do need to unshackle ourselves from that in some way. And I mean, it was a wonderful fellow called Matt McCartney who founded Embecombe that describes life. I'm sure other people do, but that life is the ceremony. And actually, if we kind of view the whole of our existence as this opportunity to be in ceremony, then it can really shift the way that we relate with the everyday. And yet I do also acknowledge that there is sometimes a time frame, and I'm not somebody traditionally who's very good at checking a watch and knowing that I have to be finished at a certain time, because in these liminal spaces, anything goes, and it's not, you know, time is not kind of functioning in the same way. So there is a time when you need to be aware of like that we have a set piece that we need to be able to complete within that time. But they can also be really brief, you know, beginnings and endings of a day. You know, simple as something like holding a stone when you start the day with your intention, each of you, you know, just sharing what it is that, you know, you wish to feel, or that's something you want to create today, that's sort of your intention, and, you know, putting that in a nice circle of stone somewhere around a tree. And that's sort of the beginning of you all setting the intention. And then from that, you've got this container to play around with. And at the end of the day, you know, you've got the stones, you can go and gather them up and put them in a bowl of water as you each say thank you for something that you are grateful for from the day. So there can be really simple moments as well. It doesn't need to be a sort of the experience of having that full flow that I described within one piece, but just seeing it as a part of the whole experience, I think would be really wonderful for you to approach the whole of the day in that way.
Yeah, that's a really nice little idea there. I was wondering about whether you had any advice for people who felt like they have either been kind of placed in a role where they could be leading some kind of ritual ceremony, like a forest school leader who might be kind of new to that role, or their group are giving them some kind of feelings that they quite like the space to be held for them in that way, or somebody who would like to maybe step into that role but hadn't done it before. I'm thinking about, some friends and I have set up what's turned into a women's circle, but without anyone really intending it for it to be that. We just started swimming outside, and then actually some of us have gone, actually, we want this to have sort of a feeling of more meaning, but we're all, I guess, feeling a little bit, actually some of us have really gone for it, which is great. But I'm thinking about people who maybe feel called to hold space in that way, but are feeling a little bit underconfident, and maybe that it's a bit silly, or that they might feel it's a bit embarrassing. Whether you have any kind of words of wisdom for beginning that kind of work?
Well, I know that even as practice now as I am, I still feel nervous before holding events. So there's something very natural, I think, about coming into a space and being seen and being the one to sort of facilitate and hold the space, which can be quite an edge, especially as well, being heard, using our voice, and what are we going to say? So I think just having compassion towards that part of ourselves to start with, and that knowing that all those present really wish well for you, like everyone is there supporting you. That always really helps me when I'm entering a space, that that everyone's kind of got your back. So whatever happens, it's going to be okay. Like really just giving yourself a bit of reassurance before, holding anything, that it will happen exactly as it needs to. And yes, we might have moments afterwards where we think, oh, I should have done it that way, or da-da-da. That will come, and we'll maybe find ways to make peace with that. But I've heard things like Judi Dench still gets nervous going on to stage. And I just wonder if it's also a sign of us really caring about something that we get nervous. In terms of then feeling maybe like you don't have ideas, or sort of, what do I do to hold that kind of space? Well, one would be, I recommend my book.
Absolutely.
Ideas. But I think like for something like a women's space, if you've been to other gatherings, retreats or workshops, and you remember something that really worked for you, see if you can just like take a piece of that inspired you and adapt it or make it your own. And certainly in shared spaces with like a women's space, it's lovely to invite a different woman each month to hold it. So then you get a different flavour of everybody, and it will always be different. There's no right or wrong way. We just bring our own unique gifts to the space. And I think it's about really having that sense of your intention of what you would really wish the other people to feel, and that be your sort of guide. So if you really want people to feel like really nourished, that they're feeling really well cared for, rested, then think about some elements of sort of self-care practice, or something that's really like massaging each other's shoulders, or making like a fun mud pack for your faces, or something like that. Or if you're feeling like you want people to really feel a sense of connectedness or belonging, then things like singing are great, because in singing spaces like we literally kind of come into harmony with each other, or being able to connect with the trees, or finding ways of really making those connections with the natural world more embodied. So having that as a guide of what it feels like, or what you wish the people present to feel, I think is really helpful. And I think that we need to, as we talked about, bring online more of that childlike playfulness and wonder. Like we can also show up with a few maybe basic materials, or see where we are and what's available to us, and just really respond in the moment to what feels right. Like what is that flicker of inspiration that comes, and bring your little one in to sort of say like, I want to see through the eyes of you with that curiosity and innocence, and what do you wish to create today, and how do you want to play? I found that really supportive, and it kind of gets out the idea of it needing to be right, or, look a certain way, that actually it can be really simple and playful, and in that I think there's a real authenticity to it as well, that it doesn't need to be anything too grand or, life-changing for people. Just keep it really simple, and a space that you enjoy to hold, that feels like it's a pleasure for you to be able to hold that space, that it's not sort of a chore that you're dreading, but it's actually something like, I really want to experience this myself, and have that as a guide as well.
That's really interesting, that idea of bringing children into those spaces and into those conversations. And actually, was just looking for, because it one of the sticky notes I made on your book was this little there was a couple of paragraphs about the children's fires, and I've come across the idea of children's fires before, and for people that haven't heard of children's fires, it's that thing of like a community coming together with the soul. If you correct me if I've not understood this, that idea of like specifically thinking about how are the decisions that we're currently making going to affect children, grandchildren, future generations of this community. And I think that is something that lots of people are missing out on. Just that time, Wem and I quite often talk about like when we do CPD stuff, and it's not necessarily about going and learning a new skill. It's just that you gave yourself an hour or two to only think about this, and that idea of setting up children's fires as a time to just go, okay, if we could park everything else for a minute and just think about this in the really long term, what does that look like? And then because most of our work, almost all of our work, is either exclusively young people at our sessions or young people and their families. And I feel like for children currently growing up, there's that sense that they are already being burdened with like eco-anxiety or undue responsibilities that having, I really value having those conversations with our groups and going, what will this look like? If children want to play here in this many years. And quite often they can bring up those feelings of like eco-anxiety and all that stuff that they are not in control of. And I wondered if you had any sense of, or any sort of suggestions on how to have those conversations and hold those children's fires with young people without giving them that sense of anxiety, I suppose.
Really honouring the work that you do in that, because I think a lot of people probably either avoid having those conversations, or when they do, it's sort of not really met with. I think a lot of adults haven't actually come to terms with it and made the space for their own feelings. So then to be able to hold the younger ones is not something we're able to do. I'm actually thinking of a book written by a friend of mine called How the World is Making Your Children Mad and What to Do About It by Louis Weinstock. It's a beautiful book, a sad book, but really like how we can be holding space for our young people with all the complexity of these times. And I think having something like a regular space, like holding a fire circle, which you could name the children's fire, and it's this space of being aware of those generations yet to come, and not just the human, but all those yet to come. And having it as a time when it is a sharing space where people talk about how they're feeling. You could bring questions in specifically about how they're feeling or how they're relating with such and such, that there is a sort of question for them to sort of riff around. And having in that space a real willingness to hear and not try and fix. And I think that's the thing that we often try to do as adults. Of course, we don't want to see our young ones struggling, but actually recognizing that their feelings are really valid and knowing that they are being witnessed in that, I think is really powerful. That's what Louis speaks to, I think, more than anything, that can bring about the healing we need. To really value that they are aware as much as we are of what's happening, because they're so in tune. And, when we recognize we're completely connected with all other beings, we're going to be aware of the grief that's a part of the earth at this time, and let alone all the humans, that there's a lot that we're carrying. And simple rituals that I think can help as well. Once we've sort of, a really simple one, again, it comes down to stones and water. But when I've held grief rituals, we have the stone as a way of expressing our grief, like really feeling the burden of that stone, like the weight of it as something that we're carrying. And we speak to what it is that's on our heart that we feel present with, and have a big bowl of water in the center, and you can place that stone in the water as a way of like giving up that burden and also allowing that grief to be cleansed in some way by the waters. You could also do it with fire in terms of sort of writing something down and offering it up to the fire to be transformed. But using the natural setting as a way of also really helping open the container for those bigger emotions. So, it might be that you've got a space where also, grief and rage are quite closely linked. And we don't often manage those stronger feelings of rage very well, children and adults. So having a space where like physically they can actually move through some of those feelings in a safe way. I'm thinking, so I held a ceremony last year called Grief, Rage and Praise. And we actually had for the rage part, these 5 stations around the room, which you could kind of recreate in an outdoor setting. We had an old big tractor tire and sticks, and we were just like hitting the tire as hard as we had. We had boxing gloves that we were boxing, tearing newspaper. It was really satisfying sort of sounds. Black charcoal on paper where they could just sort of smear those kind of markings. I think there was one more. But having a way to sort of move through it in an embodied way, because I think also we're not really taught how to be with our emotions, so we sort of bottle them up. And actually, if there's a way to physically sort of move through them and be with them and be witnessed in that, it can really help them move through. And I think for children also to sort of recognize there is power in this, that actually our grief and our rage can really inspire us and motivate us to take action and sort of focus on that it's right to be feeling these things, and actually that we can really make use of them in a way when we're in community and in a held space to channel that energy into something greater. And I think to have a space where we also then use the sort of amazing imagination of children to visualize what they would wish for those yet to come. So actually we've gone through that feeling of like, oh God, is the world going to end? What would it be like if we imagined the future that we long for, and like speak to that? So bringing in, how you imagine being in community, or what kind of creative. So I remember having an idea of a town, and people were saying like all the billboards for advertising would become like creative art spaces, all like unused industrial spaces would become communal gardens, like just allowing that kind of conversation where hope is then kindled again, so that you're not sort of ending the space with that weight of everyone's grief having been shared, that there's a sort of a way of moving through that, coming out the other side.
That's really interesting. I was just,
Beautiful.
as you were describing that like grief and rage thing, Wem and I quite often talk about how we're really comfortable with the idea that like play is not always fun. Play doesn't always look like a smiling face. Sometimes it looks like stressful, or sometimes it looks, really hard conflict resolution, or, and that's all play. And I feel really comfortable holding that as a container. And I feel really confident in expressing that to, as like a commercial business, which is what we are to an extent. It's that idea of like, I'm comfortable talking to parents and saying, yes, this is what has happened in the day, this is the experience, but I don't know that I feel necessarily as comfortable with going, this is a space where we're going to hold the children's emotions, and some of those emotions will be rage and grief and all those things. And like, that's definitely a journey I think I personally am still on, in terms of being comfortable about like, that ability to go, oh yeah, unprompted, we ended up smashing car tires for about an hour today, and they really screamed out into the woods, and they ripped up a load of stuff and burnt it. It was great. I'm okay with that from a space of play, but I'm not necessarily okay yet in terms of holding that and going, yeah, I'm comfortable being the container, the cocoon for those emotions. That's really interesting. I'm definitely got that to work on, I think. I'm super grateful of your time today. I'm conscious that we've waffled on at you, but if people have listened to all of this and they're really interested in like your work and learning more about what it is that you're up to, where can people find out about your stuff?
Thank you both so much for having me here. I really enjoyed the conversation. So my website is islamcleod.com, which has, you can sign up to my newsletter and then be the first to hear about everything I'm offering, or I do update my website with events. I'm also quite active on Instagram, and it's Isla J McLeod on Instagram if you'd like to also see a lot of imagery that I post around ceremonies and rituals that I hold.
Yeah, and your book, obviously, Rituals for Life, which is available. And yeah, that's really exciting. You're saying you're doing some more writing. It'd be really great to read some more of your stuff. Thank you so much, Isla. It's been an absolute joy speaking with you today.
Yeah, you too. And thank you for all the work you're doing with our young ones.
Yeah.
I hope that you can keep on offering these spaces with a lot more of the sense of how you can bring in ritual and the emotions and all of it into that space in a way that's really supportive for them and for us going forward, being able to manage the times that we're meeting.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you then.
Great.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Love. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You can get ad-free episodes of the Forest School podcast, as well as bonus episodes and exclusive access to upcoming guests to ask them questions before anybody else finds out about it, simply by visiting patreon.com/Children of the Forest.